All right, welcome back from your weekend. If you're tuning in for a show about Marianne Williamson today, that's not exactly what we're going to do. We're going to do a show about A Course in Miracles, without which there would not be the specific Marianne Williamson we have today. Although I think it can be argued and will be argued that A Course in Miracles, which is a very specific spiritual movement, she is not a very specific standard bearer for it. In other words, she was birthed by it, but I think she's kind of done her own things with it. But we want you to understand what this movement is. It's probably a little bit more pervasive than you might realize, and particularly, even though its numbers aren't huge, the number of kind of thought leaders who in one way or another have encountered it or been interested in it is also very interesting. I should say that in 1992, in my pursuant to my trade as a journalist, I went to a lot of, I did a big story about ACIM then, A Course in Miracles, they call it ACIM. I went to a lot of meetings. I went to a lot of meetings. We'll just leave it there. They have a lot of study groups and stuff like that. However, we have a guest right away here who has much more up-to-date information. Sam Kestenbaum is joining us, independent journalist who writes about religion for the New York Times and a contributing editor to The Forward. Hi, Sam. Welcome to our show.
Hello. Happy to be here.
So, the first thing I wanted to sort of bounce off you, I mean, we'll get into the origin story of A Course in Miracles, which will seem a little wacky to some people. But I don't know what your experience was, but going to the study groups, I didn't find them wacky or kooky. I found them kind of boring. Like, I just don't think I could talk for 90 minutes about, I am not alone in experiencing the effects of my thoughts, which I think is one of the lessons. They would just talk for like a really long time about sort of, 17 words from this text. And I realized there was a studiousness about this that I probably wasn't capable of.
Well, that's really interesting. I didn't know that you had kind of dipped into these meetings yourself. I visited several here in New York City, the place where this kind of scripture was born. And these are really kind of free-flowing study groups, the ones that I visited. And the discussion can go on and on. I think that part of it is, kind of depends what one is looking for from this text. That is, the people there would profess to finding kind of deep therapeutic meaning out of these words. I think if you're just kind of jumping in, if for example, if you're coming from a Christian background and you understand this book, which has some Christian resonance, which we'll get into, you might be a little bit kind of baffled by the more kind of free-flowing meetings. These are more like book study groups, right? There's not really a kind of a cleric, leading them. It's much more kind of grassroots. These are groups that might meet in a person's living room, a rental, kind of a basement of a kind of a church or other kind of rental spaces. These are very grassroots meetings.
Right. The movement felt to me like some kind of fusion of a Mensa meeting, because most of the people there seemed pretty smart, and kind of self-help even before Marianne Williamson got a hold of it, and traditional psychotherapy and spirituality. And that's maybe not all that surprising, because maybe we should get into the origin story here. The people who started this were very much imbued with a lot of those things. I mean, this basically is a spiritual movement started by psychotherapists.
Yeah, I think that's right. The woman Helen Schuckman and her collaborator Bill Thetford, who were working as research psychologists at Columbia Presbyterian, they produced this text. Helen Schuckman came to believe she was channeling the kind of inner words or the spirit of the historical Jesus. And over the course of several years, she produces this dense channeled tome that, in collaboration with her, with Bill, who was her collaborator, they kind of whittle this down into this still very long but much shorter multi-volume text that is designed to be a self-study text. So if we think back to these meeting groups where there's no leader, that's kind of by design. This is meant to be something that one can work through themselves, and the language of it, as you know from kind of dipping into this, is very dense, very kind of meandering, very mystical. And it fuses together language which we might take to be Christian, right? There's mention of crucifixion. There's mention of the Holy Spirit. But it's also using language like the ego. So it's mixing in kind of Freudian or Jungian language as well.
Right. And it's, I won't make this point later on the show too, but I mean, it resembles Mormonism in no observable way. But its origin story is a little bit Mormon-y in the sense that you have this revealed word coming to a specific person, a revealed word that is Christian in nature and purports to be, every bit as valid as anything in the Bible and considerably more up to date.
I think that's right. I mean, I know that some core students might kind of bristle at that comparison, but I think understanding this as an American scripture, as a kind of a reinterpretation or riff, or kind of almost like Talmudic kind of reexamination of a scripture which came before it. I think that's a very I think it's a good way to understand A Course in Miracles. And in some ways, it suggests that it's kind of correcting misconceptions that previously people have held about the Christian Bible.
Right. Oh, Sam, it is super Talmudic. I mean, really, the old thing, if you get three rabbis together, you got four opinions. But that's, very much the way these meetings go, too. I mean, there is a constant churn over these handfuls of words. What do they mean? How can they be interpreted? How do they apply to this, that, and the other situation that's going on in the people's realities right now? I think that kind of scholarly-ish discussion is a big part of it.
Right. I think that's what people really get out of these meetings, is that they are allowed to be the interpreter as well, and to kind of extract meaning, to make meaning, from this text, and to apply it to their own lives. They're not looking up to a preacher to do that for them. They are empowered to interpret this text.
Now, I think one of the many ways in which it differs from a lot of spiritual traditions that we could think of, particularly American religions with American texts, is in the way that it jumps pretty quickly from the language of spirit to the language of therapy, to the language of self-improvement in the broadest sense, bringing in really clinical psychoanalytic styles, that this is meant to be a spiritual practice that's really supposed to help you right here and now, right? There's a way in which you are supposed to, there's even I think a legend that Schuckman and Thetford were having terrible problems in their own work life together. They couldn't get along, they couldn't agree, and then this thing came along. It was the first thing that got straightened out, was their set of problems. Right. But there's a way in which you're supposed to get better at life because you have this.
Right. No, I think it's kind of in direct, response to that kind of therapeutic demand that many Americans were making then, have long made, and continue to make from their kind of religious or spiritual tradition. That is, what can this do kind of for me in this right now? How can this improve my life? And it speaks directly to that. It's not where now, for example, a rabbi or a minister might be kind of integrating meditation into services or something like that in response to these kind of calls for kind of therapeutic answers. A Course in Miracles really bubbles out of that impulse. So it's directly related to the kind of therapeutic call. And you're right about this anecdote about kind of the interpersonal conflict. And the Course in Miracles is very much interested in interpersonal conflicts and how to love one another. It's about kind of solving or dissolving those interpersonal contexts and conflicts and producing miracles out of that through that shift in perception, as I'm sure you'll get into later. Right.
We should say that Helen Schuckman herself, once again, she's the psychoanalyst and I think academic who allegedly received this long scripture, which shows no signs of whittling, no matter what Sam says. She was kind of a reluctant prophet, really kind of never really out in front of this movement. And like so many therapists and prophets unable to benefit from it, it would seem.
Yeah, that's the kind of legend of Helen as the unwilling prophet, right? It recalls to mind so many other kind of reluctant seers, or you think of Moses kind of unwilling to take this leadership position. I think that story of Helen is now recalled by course students, by the publishers, by people who are interested in this text. At the time when it came out, it's true, Helen was very uneasy with this experience and unsure of what it meant. She was, kind of coming from a secular or at least non-practicing Jewish background. And the fact that this was a kind of explicitly about a historical Jesus, I think was uncomfortable to her. And yeah, when this book finally was published in 1975, Helen's name was never attached to it. Of course, in the kind of small circle, the kind of salons where this was first being read in like the Upper West Side, people did know that Helen was kind of behind this text, but no, she was not a kind of a charismatic prophet in any way. And the publisher, Judith Scutch, who is now in California, who was there in the early days, was telling me how she believed that Helen believed in the kind of value of this material, but she was kind of unwilling or unable to apply it to her own life. And this was kind of a contradiction or just a kind of a tension in the figure that is Helen Schucman.
So this whole process starts around 65, kind of spills into the 70s. By the 80s, it's around as something that people can pick up and be aware of. One of the people who picks it up is a young woman who's in New York City at the time. She's a spiritual seeker. She's seeking God. She's looked into Ram Dass and I think TM and some other stuff. And her name is Marianne Williamson. And at a certain point, she crosses paths with the text and becomes its most visible proponent, not immediately, but as a result of writing a bestseller off of it. But Sam, I sense there's not exactly a one-to-one mapping between Williamsonism, if we could call such a doctrine by a name, and A Course in Miracles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right, that Marianne becomes kind of foremost popularizer of this book in the 80s and then basically into the early 90s with the release of her first book, A Return to Love, which is billed as a kind of an extended interpretation based on the principles of A Course in Miracles. And this is what puts her on the Oprah show. And then the text and her interpretation of it is kind of broadcast across the country in a new way. Yeah, I mean, I think the distinction between, Marianne and her kind of stardom, I think that's right, that a reader of a Marianne Williamson book might never actually find themselves becoming a student of A Course in Miracles. But many students of A Course in Miracles at this point know Marianne Williamson, and that is, you don't necessarily have to come reach A Course in Miracles if you become a Marianne Williamson fan, but many people do. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but her star at a certain point, comes to eclipse the Course, at least in kind of a certain public discussion. In many interviews on the Larry King show, it was kind of mistakenly said that this is the Course in Marianne Williamson's Course in Miracles, and she would kind of quickly seek to, in her telling, she would kind of quickly seek to correct people, to say, no, I'm not. I'm just a student of A Course in Miracles like everybody else. But there is this sense that Marianne's stardom becomes larger, at least more public, than this largely kind of underground grassroots movement.
So, there's maybe another difference here that's worth exploring a little bit. I mean, A Course in Miracles, the text and the way it's explored by its very serious adherents, has a whole bunch of things in it that are very mystical and even kind of drift towards maybe the notion of Maya in Eastern religions, that kind of sense that it's all an illusion, that maybe nothing's really here, and certainly that our bodies are illusions and all this kind of stuff. Marianne Williamson, not that she ever completely relinquishes some of that thinking, she does, as I think you've noted. I mean, Donald Trump was influenced, if he was influenced by any kind of nominally spiritual movement, it would have been Norman Vincent Peale and the power of positive thinking, a practice which it once again sort of says observable results pretty much right away. And there's a way in which Williamson's extension of or interpretation of A Course in Miracles kind of is on a parallel track with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, that these two figures, and I don't want to overstate this, but
right.
but these two figures, are kind of products of American metaphysical movements. Or at least drawing from that well, which, some of these ideas have just so, deeply kind of penetrated the culture that it's kind of can be hard to kind of tease them apart. But that's right. Donald Trump he had his own kind of background in the self-help kind of milieu. He released the Art of the Deal. He was kind of seen as an aspirational figure of wealth. His childhood pastor, as you said, was Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking, and he grew up attending Marble Collegiate here in Manhattan, where Peale oversaw that church. And the Marianne Trump connection, yes, they both kind of rose to fame. Also in the 90s, they're kind of aesthetic similarities too. They rose to fame. They're kind of the kind of celebrity pantheon of America, and Marianne also gave regular lectures at Marble Collegiate just by chance, also on A Course in Miracles, not from the pulpit, but in that same space. So, and the two crossed paths once in the 90s as well. But
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just that. So, right, they're both kind of drawing upon this idea that thoughts are causative. If we think that Trump is doing that, he's not as explicit, of course, but these are just kind of two figures among many, I think, that are also influenced by these ideas.
I hadn't realized it until I think I read it in your article that Marianne Williamson briefly did try the pulpit out, did try to have an actual discernible church, like a building where she was a preacher, and kind of decided it wasn't really for her.
That's right. Yeah. So Marianne, after kind of achieving some stardom through these books, she comes to head a mega church outside Detroit, which was associated with Unity. So for any listener who knows, Unity is another kind of blending of New Thought or New Age and Christian teaching. So her kind of aesthetic, her ideas, A Course in Miracles, also kind of blends well in this setting, at least at first. A Course in Miracles had found some popularity in some purchase in Unity churches, and so Marianne comes in and she has a lot of celebrity and a lot of new ideas about how to run this church. She establishes a gospel choir. Steven Tyler comes one time to play in the morning. So she brings her kind of pizzazz to this role. Ultimately, it kind of splinters apart. Some congregants become uneasy with the political direction of her messages from the pulpit. And at one point, she suggests that they break away from the Unity kind of umbrella movement. And at this point, it kind of comes apart, and she is either kind of ousted or leaves amidst this conflict, steps down. So yeah, she had a brief, or more than brief. She was there for several years, running this mega church outside Detroit. So yeah, she had a legitimate kind of pulpit experience as well.
I had somehow or other missed the fact that it was a unity church. If it's the same unity movement that I'm thinking of, I always thought of that as the closest thing to a direct extension of transcendentalism, the sort of the Ralph Waldo Emerson doctrine made into a church. But we probably don't have world enough in time to discuss that. Although it would be interesting. All right, so. Obviously, as she appeared last week in particular on the debates, Marianne Williamson, she reached people, and some of the post-debate social media activity, Google searches, Twitter activity, really kind of suggested that as she's talking about emotional turbulence and dark psychic forces, and really expressing things, as David Brooks pointed out, in a kind of with a kind of moral clarity that is maybe not typical of the Democratic Party, that she got people's attention in a pretty interesting way. Maybe not a way that will translate into her inhabiting the White House, although she's been there before too. But I don't know. Maybe you could say, I know you've interviewed her. I just reading some of her stuff, I read an open letter that she wrote to Hillary Clinton right before the 2015-2016 campaign, where she kind of nailed with quite a bit of accuracy what I actually think was Clinton's biggest political problem. This is a woman who, to a certain degree, is not a political novice.
Mm-hmm. Right. She'll. So Marianne Williamson has spent 30 plus years in the public eye, and I kind of remind colleagues and friends of this as they're kind of encountering her for the first time, saying, how is she kind of bewildered by her charm. Somehow she's been in the public eye, but people have kind of forgotten about her. But she's right. She's no political novice. I mean, she's kind of had an interest in kind of activism of a kind. She's also really good at interviewing and public speaking. You don't spend 30 years as a kind of a celebrity and not know how to do that as a craft. So that's not I don't want to appear cynical about it, but just to say, this is a space that she knows well. She knows how to read a room, and she knows how to speak to people's concerns and kind of read them emotionally as she's kind of risen as a therapeutic spiritual leader.
And my guess is that just as many people have read her books and never worked all the way back to the original text of A Course in Miracles, that's going to happen again, no matter how interested people are going to get in Marianne Williamson. You and I are probably having one of the relatively few conversations about A Course in Miracles that it's going to go along with this campaign season.
Yeah, I think that her star, has kind of eclipsed this. She was on the Bill Maher show on Friday, and Bill Maher, who of course is a very kind of outspoken anti-religious kind of a person, he kind of pressed her on the authorship of this book and what it meant that this was the book that was kind of had driven her fame, and Marianne's very. She's good at that answer too. She said, "Oh, maybe Helen thought she was channeling Jesus. Maybe she did. The book doesn't mean you have to believe in Jesus." And Bill Maher compared it to Scientology. She said, "Oh, how can you do that? These are not the same thing." So I think that she also knows. Is not going to kind of put this on the forefront. Not that there's kind of anything wrong with A Course in Miracles, but I think that she also knows how this text might be kind of received by a broader public and might be kind of interested in keeping it a little bit in the background, at least for now.
Well, Sam Kestenbaum, your article was terrific. First of all, independent journalist who writes about religion for the New York Times, a contributing editor for The Forward. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
And we are now going to take a little break. When we come back, you will meet somebody who has stayed involved and immersed with A Course in Miracles, someone whose involvement goes back to the time of Helen Schucman. So stay tuned for that.
About Donald Trump, about how we're going to beat Donald Trump. You harness fear for political purposes, and only love can cast that out. So I have a feeling you know it. So I have a feeling you know it. So I have a feeling you know what you're doing. I'm going to harness love. For political purposes, love. For political purposes. So I have a feeling.
We are doing a show today about A Course in Miracles. I have wanted to do this show for a long time, but the candidacy and excitement caused by Marianne Williamson has provided an interesting occasion to do that. Joining us now is John Mundy, author of several self-help books based on A Course in Miracles, former university lecturer and publisher of Miracles magazine. He's the executive director of the All Faith Seminary International in New York City. Thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
So maybe just begin with your involvement in A Course in Miracles, which I think dates all the way back to the early 1970s. What drew you to the text and the movement?
Well, first let me say how I met the authors of the course, or Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford. I wrote a book in 1973 called Learning to Die. It was based on some mysticism. That was really my main area of study all my life, actually. That's what I did my dissertation on, that sort of thing. And Helen and Bill came to a talk that I was giving in 1973. And if I'd have known who was sitting there, these guys really had some experience with mystical experiences. But anyhow, I was like 29 years old at the time. And the next year after that, I wrote a letter that got published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology expressing interest in being in contact with people who were working in the fields of psychotherapy and spirituality. Bill saw my letter, reminded Helen about our meeting, and suggested that she complete the writing of what was called the psychotherapy pamphlet, which came after the course had been completed. It fits in with the teachings of the course. He said, this man is looking for this information. Why don't you finish writing this so we can give it to him? Helen called me in April 1975, said, I have something for you. I didn't know what she was talking about, but I agreed to go meet her and Ken Wapnick and Bill at Ken's little apartment on East 17th Street in New York City. Helen sat on Ken's daybed and told me about the course, how it came into existence, and how it affected the other people in the room, and gave me the manuscript of the psychotherapy pamphlet. And not too long thereafter, Judy Scott-Switson saw to the Xeroxing of several copies of the Course in Miracles. So there was a small group of us that got started studying the course when it was still in manuscript format.
Ultimately, when I talk to people who've been heavily involved in A Course in Miracles, and we should say this is an unusual spiritual movement also in the sense that it has no real hierarchy, no real canonical structure or anything like that. It basically is what the people who decide to use it and read it and talk about it make it into for themselves. And often talking to somebody who's been heavily involved with A Course in Miracles for a number of years, if you ask them what they're getting out of it, the answer will almost sound indistinguishable from if you ask somebody what they're getting out of really good psychotherapy. They often don't even, you wouldn't, unless you knew, you wouldn't know you were talking to someone in a spiritual movement. You might easily, based on the things that they say, think, oh, you're seeing a really good therapist right now. So I don't know, where does one end and the other begin? Or maybe there is no real distinction between psychotherapy and ACIM.
Well, I don't think in that sense that there are. After what we're talking about here is good mental health. We're talking about clarity of seeing, but on a spiritual level, not simply on a relationship level, but about really living our lives in terms of the way God would have us live our lives. My favorite analogy is GPS. The Course talks about what it calls God's plan for salvation. So God's plan for salvation is something that's available for everyone. That's totally across the board. It's all unique in terms of the kind of path we walk, but still there's a way that gets us ultimately where the Course is going. Ultimately, it's going to enlightenment. It's taking us all the way home. It's taking us back to the remembrance of heaven, or the truth, where we came from, where we're returning to. And this world, in that sense, is a kind of school or mental hospital or reformatory. We're here to wake up and to really remember, and that's what we're doing here. And this is a path that it's a really practical advice on how to live in such a way that we can. The Course refers to this world as a dream, so how we awaken from the dream. When Buddha had his experience under the Bodhi tree, And he came back to the deer park at Benares, and his disciples saw him coming, and they said, "There's something different about you." And they said, "What is it?" And he says, "I'm awake." And the first book that Ken Wapnick wrote on the Course in Miracles was about awakening as well.
You know, one of the controversies, not a massive controversy so far, but that has been a little bit attendant on A Course in Miracles, that because it is a movement that, you know, says, I am not a body, I am free, that talks about the essentially delusional quality of reality as we know it, is that you can start getting into things like, well, then are vaccines worth doing? What is AIDS? There's a pretty controversial quote of Marianne Williamson's about AIDS, people maybe not seeking treatment for things. As somebody who's really been close to the movement for a long time, what's your take on that? What's your response to that?
Well, ultimately, and let's underline the word ultimately, the Course says if the mind can heal the body, but the body can't heal the mind, then the mind is obviously the stronger thing, right? Mm-hmm. At the same time that that's true, the Course has makes it clear, if you don't think that your faith is strong enough, take the pill. Take the shot, you know, do what you need to do. I mean, you've got to have a tremendous amount of faith. There are people who get well, who overcome cancer, people, and we call them miracles when that happened. You know, something happened that they turned around. But in the meantime, if you don't think you're fully there and you've got the faithfulness all the way, do what your doctor tells you to do. The Course is very similar to Christian Science. But it's not the same on this point at all.
I'm wondering how, for someone who takes the Course very seriously and has stayed close to the original ideas of the Course and the text, as you see Marianne Williamson, who's inevitably umbilically associated with the Course in Miracles, venture into the political arena, which is no respecter of persons, no respecter of very much, really. Do you feel a little protective of your own spiritual practice?
You know, I've known Marianne since 1973, so I've known, that's 46 years or something. Mm-hmm. And I've never known her to be anything but generous and committed. She started helping out with this AIDS program years ago when I was moving my church that I had in New York City from one spot to another, and I needed a different location for a while. She offered me the Manhattan Center for Living, where she was working, as a place where we could have our services. She's always been super generous. And, you know, there's an interesting thing that happened in El Paso just a few days ago. Mm-hmm. So after that happened, Marianne sent out to her constituents a prayer. Do you think any of the other political candidates sent out a prayer?
No.
I mean, that was a prayer for the people who were shot, the people who were suffering, et cetera. Amazing.
On the other hand, in the public discourse, I mean, I don't in any way quibble with what you're saying, although I would quibble to the extent that in the public discourse, that whole idea of thoughts and prayers is a little bit out of favor with some people. The notion that you send a prayer instead of fixing the policy that's wrong, getting the high capacity magazine guns out of the hands of killers, universal background checks. There's a lot of people who say we don't need prayers anymore. We've had plenty of those. People pray for Parkland. People pray for Aurora. People pray for Sandy Hook. It doesn't change anything. And that, you know, gets into an interesting area too. I'm not asking you to comment on her candidacy at all, but one of the things she talks about is, that policy won't fix this until you fix the morality of it.
Right. And prayer is just the first step. I mean, that's just the opening door. You know, beyond that, obviously things have got to be done to change things so that this doesn't keep happening. You know, there's a very interesting line in the Course. It says, let him be what he is, seek not to make of love an enemy. And when it comes to Marianne, I just think, let her be who she is. She's really doing a great job in terms of trying to see things differently and trying to take things to a higher level, so it's not just a matter of arguing and debating with each other, but it's actually seeing things in a wholly new way, because we really do need to see things in a wholly new way.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's one of the reasons that she resonated so well last week and that there was so much activity, was that people were hungry to hear someone explore in much more stark moral terms the situation we're in. That's a point also made by David Brooks in the New York Times. I'm assuming that would have been gratifying for you.
Oh, yeah. Right.
But on the other hand, I guess maybe, with A Course in Miracles, if somebody had told me that, and I first got interested in it in 1992 and went to the study groups and wrote an article about it, I wouldn't have guessed that it didn't feel like a call to political action. It's such an interior book. It's so much about the self. It's so much about fix yourself, figure out what's going on with you. I wouldn't have guessed that it was easily transferable to the public sphere.
I wouldn't either, except that this is the way it's transformed her.
Mm-hmm.
So she sees things differently. She sees things from a larger perspective. And as I said earlier, she's always willing to help. I mean, she really wants to start a department for peace and that sort of thing. That's really transforming. That's helping. It transformed her, and now she wants to take it out and transform in a larger way. It's still about going deep inside. It's still something that's very, very personal, of course. And you've got to take it inside and let it transform you first.
I think that's a great way to put it. John Mundy, author of several help books based on A Course in Miracles, former university lecturer and the publisher of Miracles Magazine, executive director of All Faith Seminary International in New York City. Thank you for being with us today.
Sure.
And we're going to take a little bit of a break. I wanted to talk to one person, because I think one of the problems is, one of the difficulties of measuring the size of the movement, you're going to hear me say this on the other side of the break too, is you can't just go by how many people have obtained the book, because people sometimes pick the book up, put the book down, maybe pick it up again. I have owned 2 different copies of the book, both of them given to me by the same person. I won't say who, but people have all kinds of relationships with a movement like this one. We wanted to talk to somebody who had spent some time with the movement, takes it seriously still, but isn't necessarily 100% foursquare in it. So I've never figured out, are we allowed to say who this person really is? I don't know. He may have to remain a mystery how we found this person. You can write to me individually, and I'll tell you how we found Russell. But you're going to meet Russell on the other side of this.
4 seconds. Starve on this planet. Rehearsal is over.
I am very frustrated. I've been going through this huge book for hours, and nowhere does it say how much to use in potato salad. What's that? Oh, I thought it was A Course in Miracle Whip. Today's show is produced by Betsy Kaplan with help from Josh Nalea and me, Kyone Wolf. Our interns are Jesse Steinmetz and Carolyn McCusker. The part of Bill Curry was played by Oprah. On tomorrow's show, to mark the death of Fast Jack Farrell, we'll re-air our show on conmen and hustlers. And now, back to Colin.
Whenever people try to figure out how many people participate in A Course in Miracles, it's hard to do because there's no centralized organizing authority, as we've already said. And you could look at sales of the book, but that's a little deceptive too, because one thing that clearly happens is that people pick the book up and they get something out of it, and maybe they put the book back down, and then maybe 20 years later they look back at the book. And so how do you evaluate that? We thought it would be interesting to talk to somebody who's had a couple of intellectual and spiritual encounters with A Course in Miracles. That person is Russell Graves. He's joining us right now. Welcome to our conversation.
Thank you, Colin. Happy to be here.
So in the 1970s, as I understand it, you were at Venice Beach and you were spiritually questing, like a lot of people, young people were at that time. So how did you encounter A Course in Miracles?
I don't really remember. I just remember that it was sort of the new thing that was kind of floating through the community of people that considered themselves interested in spiritual matters. And someone gave me a copy. I began to look at it, and it was intriguing, but I didn't get heavily involved at that time.
And one reason was, as I understand it, that, it starts with the premise, as we've covered already on the show, that it was dictated to one person by Jesus. And I'm gathering that as kind of a West Coast spiritual seeker, maybe you weren't that interested in anything that's specifically Christian.
Yes, I think that's probably daunting for anybody that approaches the Course, whether they're the folks that are approaching it from a more Eastern spiritual side of the aisle find that although it's supposed to be a secular text, that it uses completely Christian language and imagery is off-putting. And then, of course, for folks that are from more of a Christian background, it's equally, if not more, off-putting, that it's an attempt to kind of redefine Jesus' message for the modern world, which they find unsettling.
Right. I mean, I think in a way it was somewhat similar to the manner in which Mormonism freaked Christians out in the 19th century, because it was essentially, like a software patch on an old doctrine. Similarly, I think you see that there. But so a couple of decades go by. It gets to be somewhere around 2000, and now you're back having maybe a little bit of a different relationship. What is that relationship?
Well, I think the relationship shifted. I think that, that the early days of like sort of living that life and focus on the spiritual search shifted, and I had a job and that wasn't my primary focus, but I was still struggling internally with my own sense of self, and I was able to get something more essential from the Course's message, and I also joined a small group of people that studied the Course together and that had a facilitator, and it was kind of helpful to move through the density of the Course and get its message a little bit more clearly that way.
Right. So that seems to be kind of one of the basic units of A Course in Miracles, is you have that small group. It's essentially a study group, and it seems to me that it's attractive to people who are willing to study text in a very focused way. Was that your sense?
Yes, I think, although the Course is designed for self-directed study, it seems like almost spontaneously, without any hierarchical impetus, people tend to form small groups and enjoy sharing the Course's message with each other and helping each other sort of define its meaning for themselves.
Obviously, the text itself is a really complicated one. The workbook that follows it is very complicated as well. Are there one or two simple lessons that you feel that you were able to extract and apply to your own life?
Sure. I think that's probably true for everybody, especially people that have at some point moved on, that the dense and complicated sense of the text disappears and you're left with one or two essential things that you carry with you. And I think for me, as someone who, struggled with their sense of self and their sense of unworthiness and insufficiency in many ways back in those days, that the essential thing that I carried with me from the Course was its idea that I would say the fundamental human problem, usually on a deeply subconscious level, is our belief in our own sinfulness, in our own, which to people from not from a Christian tradition might have trouble with the word sinfulness, but so let me just say our own lack of love, our own selfishness, our own idea of our shortcomings as loving individuals. So the Course deals with that in a way that I found liberating and true for whether one is aware of it or not, or struggling with it, as I was, that exists at the rock bottom level of the subconscious for all of us, that on some level we all believe in our own shortcoming, that we all fall short in some way in our lack of love, in our separation from Source, and that the towering guilt and fear of punishment that exists based on our belief in that then gets projected onto others, in the form of fear and hatred, which is, what we see so rampant in the world. And that we can get to see that is really our own self-hatred, and that we get to see that vividly through our reactions to other people, through our feelings that they don't deserve love, or they deserve punishment, or they are the problem. Each condemning thought for others becomes like a reminder, like a temple bell, to look inward at our own self-hatred. It's a method of forgiving ourselves for this crazy, mad idea that we are separate from love or separate from Source, through the forgiving of other people, which is really forgiving our own projections. And perhaps that was a little bit complicated and a little bit dense, my explanation, but
no, that was pretty good, I thought. That was good.
That's what I carried with me. That's what the Course, it has a funny name, A Course in Miracles.
Yeah.
But that's what it defines as a miracle. Anytime you change, you shift your hatred or condemnation or fear of another person to love through forgiveness.
The way that you describe it, too, it does sound not incompatible with Buddhism. There are lots of traditions that talk about that idea that to whatever degree we separate ourselves from the source of everything and from the source of love, the more we essentially become confused and self-hating.
Right. And the Course, if there's any, I don't know if it's different, but perhaps Buddhism and Advaita are saying the same thing. But the Course would say that, in fact, we never have. That would be impossible. We never have separated from love. And that it's only the idea of the crazy mad idea, as they call it, of our own sinfulness that causes us not to know that. And that there's nothing really to say. The Course doesn't talk much about love because there's nothing we can know about love. It can only be experienced. But the Course says that relieved of our own belief, subconscious belief in our own sinfulness, the reality of our true nature as love will be effortlessly revealed, that we indeed have never and could not possibly be separate from source or separate from love.
So some of those ideas, in a more condensed way and a more popularized way, have made up some of the body of the writing of Marianne Williamson, and now they are making their way into presidential debates. Is that a gratifying thing to you, to hear somebody talking in spiritual terms about political questions?
Yeah, it's extremely gratifying, and it's one of the reasons back in when the DNC set the quotas for donations in order to be on the stage, that I, with my limited funds, decided to give a few bucks to Marianne just to have her voice present on the stage. Although I didn't, and probably still don't see her as a viable candidate, I wanted that message to be at least part of the debate.
And I think it's resonated, too. I mean, if you look at even, some of the internet numbers at the end of the last debate, people started Googling her. People started trying to figure out who she really was and what she was all about, which is an indication that there is some kind of hunger or interest to have somebody talk in those terms about these questions.
I was actually surprised that she's getting the traction that she has gotten, and she's kind of reframed, the debate and probably the position that perhaps Democrats might need to take in their quest to dethrone Donald Trump, that the most fundamental question is probably a moral one. Who do we want to be as a nation? How do we want to see ourselves? How do we want our children and grandchildren to see themselves as Americans? And I think a lot of the Democratic candidates probably feel that way, probably have the same kind of moral imperatives and outrage that Marianne has, but have felt perhaps it wasn't politically expedient to say so. And now perhaps they will. The more viable candidates will pick up on that and express that message as well.
So, Russell Graves, how ultimately does A Course in Miracles, both in its substance and in terms of the influence it's had on you, compare with some of the other movements that you've been drawn to?
That's a tough question. I've never been part of a spiritual group per se, or I've never called myself a Buddhist or an Advaitist or any of those things. But each thing, including the Course in Miracles and Est and all the other things I've been involved with, it would be hard to compare them. It seems like from each thing I've carried an essential message that have informed my life, and that I don't know if I can answer that, Colin. I don't know if I can. It's important though, and that fundamental message of forgiveness and forgiveness of others as a way to forgive our deep feelings of inadequacy and worthlessness and selfishness has been something that I just continue. It's become so natural and part of my life that it's almost at this point spontaneous, that when I notice myself thinking of someone else, whether it's of someone in my family or a friend, or whether it's Donald Trump or whoever, when I think of them as unworthy of love and worthy of punishment, it's almost automatic that I return to look at myself and where I might be coming from in myself and take that message of forgiveness. I don't know, maybe that's happening, and maybe Marianne's message will express that, although I don't know what Marianne's relationship with the Course is now, or how she holds it, or how she would answer these questions. Another thing I retain from it is that I can't argue with that is the fundamental problem of humanity, and that willingness to project our unconscious guilt onto others is what allows tyrants and would-be tyrants to provide scapegoats for people and direct people's hatred outwards to the fear and the frightening specter of their own projections. So I think without dealing with that on some level, without having that foundation, I think all other measures are bound to probably fail at some point or another, regardless of what side wins in any given moment.
That's a wonderful place to end. Russell Graves, a one-time student of A Course in Miracles. Thanks for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you. I don't know how much wisdom it was, but thanks for having me.